All right, we have a good number of folks right on time. We love to see it. All right. Um, and just looking at time, making sure we have enough, I will get into um, today's session. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Erin. I use she, her pronouns, and you'll be seeing very little of me today. I am the moderator for today's session, so I'm just here to make sure we are all comfortable in the space, and then I'll be in the back end. If you run into any issues, you can feel free to reach out to me in the chat, whether you find my name specifically or just reach out. I'll be keeping track the whole time. So there will be a few things to pay attention to today. There should be a ribbon at the top or bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, it might be minimized, so you might just need to swipe your finger or mouse across. There's three main buttons to pay attention to. The first is the chat pod. This is where you can ask questions, send your own answers to other people's questions. I'll be sharing resources that we discuss. You can share your own as well. Don't worry if you aren't able to grab those. There will be a follow-up email that'll go to set out automatically tomorrow, and that will have every link that is shared as well. The next section to pay attention to is the Q&A. This is another place where you can ask questions, but it has the additional feature of allowing you to be anonymous. That is completely okay with us. Just make sure you click that if that's what makes you most comfortable, and know that those come to the back end. So for the most part, Kim and Kari today won't be able to pay attention to the chat, but there will be a Q&A period at the end. Any questions that are sent, Bree and I will be grabbing them and making sure that they get answered in that period. And then the last button to pay attention to along the bottom there will say captions or CC. This only affects your screen, so feel free to turn that on or off as works best for you. And before I pass it over, I'll just quickly explain who we are in case you haven't heard of Egale. So for those of you who don't know us, Egale is Canada's leading organization for 2SLGBTQI people and issues. We improve and save lives through research, education, awareness, and by advocating for human rights and equality in Canada and around the world. Our work helps create societies and systems that reflect the universal truth that all persons are equal and none is other. And with that being said, I will pass it over to Bree.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, my name is Bree. I'm a research officer at Egale, and I'm super excited today to welcome you to our third Research Highlights webinar of the year. We do have one more happening in September, and so I'll post the link to our webpage about that if you wanted to learn more about that. But today, super excited. We have Kari and Kim, and they'll be sharing insights and resources from a project seeking to understand how to empower educators and peers to prevent gender-based violence among 2SLGBTQI youth in Newfoundland and Labrador. So Kari is a passionate 2SLGBTQIA+ community leader, systems navigator, educator, and researcher committed to fostering more equitable communities where every individual can thrive in all aspects of their lives. Their work is focused on gay-straight alliances, or GSAs, and the role of GSAs advisors in leveraging resources to foster safer and more caring learning environments for 2SLGBTQI+ youth. And then Kim is a qualitative researcher and senior research officer here at Egale, and her work is grounded in anti-oppressive, trauma-informed approaches, and her ongoing projects focus on 2SLGBTQI healthcare experiences, mental health disparities, housing disparities, and gender-based violence prevention. So with that, I'll pass it off to these two folks to tell us more about their project.
Thanks, Bree. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, Kari and I will both be taking turns to share some of the key findings and takeaways from the project that was just introduced. And the title of the project is quite long, so I'll use a shortened version throughout, but it's entitled Empowering Educators and Peers to Reduce GBV Experienced by 2SLGBTQI Youth in Newfoundland and Labrador. So before we present on the project itself, I'd like to provide a land acknowledgement, and Kari will then do the same since we're joining from different locations. So I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We also pay respect to all Indigenous people in the region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. When doing land acknowledgements, it's important to note that the First Nations who have been here since time immemorial did not have the choice to welcome us as settlers. The violence of colonialism is ongoing, but so too are movements and individuals who are fiercely resisting this violence. We cannot recognize Indigenous struggles for self-determination throughout Turtle Island without connecting struggles with those suffering the impacts of colonial violence around the world. And this includes discrimination, marginalization faced by Two-Spirit and LGBTQI people. So with that, I'll pass it to Kadi to do a land acknowledgement from where they're joining.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm joining from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and as a representative of Planned Parenthood Newfoundland and Labrador Sexual Health Center. Here, we are newcomer settlers and guests of this land, and I would also like to acknowledge that we're living in and working on current and traditional Mi'kmaq and Beothuk land here in Newfoundland, and Inuit from Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut, and the Innu of Labrador. Indigenous peoples have lived and cared for this land for more than 15,000 years. And today, Newfoundland and Labrador is still the home of many Indigenous people across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that as settlers on this land, we directly benefit from the ongoing process of colonization, and that also includes within healthcare systems. As an agency, we're committed to ongoing process of increasing our capacity and provide culturally safe healthcare that meets the diverse needs of Indigenous peoples. Remember that these acknowledgements must be followed with ongoing commitments to these same communities, so that left us a reflection too, and that land acknowledgements are recognition of our responsibility to Indigenous lands and peoples.
Right, so just so we have a bit of a map to guide us through today's webinar, I'll provide a really brief overview. So we'll get started with the project background, kind of explaining the what and the why of why we started this venture together. We'll move on to discuss the methods and some key findings that emerged from our data collection. So we'll chat a bit about themes emerging from our qualitative interviews, as well as some key findings from our social network analysis surveys, which we'll refer to as SNA throughout the webinar, and Kadi will be unpacking some of those findings in a bit. We'll then move on to discuss participatory action research activities that we conducted after the data collection phase was complete, and then closing out with the knowledge mobilization phase of the project, which involves how we shared what we learned throughout the course of this project. And then finally, we'll have an open Q&A session where you're welcome to ask any questions that come up. And then we'll also take some moments to respond to what came up in the chat. So in the broadest sense, what was our project about? So this was a nearly 2-year project. And although GBV targeting 2SLGBTQI youth is a nationwide issue, this project sought to address it in the context of Newfoundland and Labrador specifically. The project was a collaboration between Egale Canada, Planned Parenthood Newfoundland and Labrador Sexual Health Centre, the Labrador Friendship Centre, Mokami Status of Women Council, and Kinship Consulting. Through interviews and surveys, this project looked to better understand the state of GBV education, specifically healthy relationships education, throughout the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as the relationship between that education and GBV prevention. So using participatory action research, also referred to as PAR, we hope to better understand the opportunities and barriers for healthy relationships from the perspectives of multiple groups. So we wanted to see what decision makers, like school board leaders, had to say about this issue, what teachers had to say, teachers and counselors, and 2SLGBTQI youth themselves. Further, we explored what role nonprofits can play in increasing decision maker buy-in, in helping with educator upskilling, and informational uptake by 2SLGBTQI youth. So in brief, again, why did we conduct this research? as you may know, there's an immediate need to improve provincial curriculum around topics of consent, bodily autonomy, healthy relationships, supporting survivors, and how to spot warning signs. With GBV being a recurring issue impacting the health and well-being of all youth and 2SLGBTQI youth at higher rates, our project partners joined forces with youth and educators. And with educators, these folks play a really major role in equipping young people with the skills and education that they need to identify GBV, as well as resources and connecting them to those resources if they do experience GBV. So Kari and I will both explain some aspects of the methodological facet of this project. So at the highest level, the guiding methodological framework for this project was participatory action research. So PAR is an appropriate methodology when the objective of a project is change or transformation. PAR engages the local community, i.e. those affected by the issue at hand, to create intentional change and to improve the situation through collaboration. So those affected by the issue of GBV and GBV prevention initiatives throughout the province were engaged as co-researchers with a seat at the decision-making table regarding everything from project objectives, outcomes, activities that we did, and the decisions we made surrounding knowledge mobilization. In this project, our 11 co-researchers were teachers. So we had 6 teachers who were our co-researchers and 5 2SLGBTQI youth. We then moved on to our data collection phase. So this involved a mixed methods approach, and we did 17 qualitative interviews with educators and youth, and we'll discuss those themes in coming slides. But we landed on qualitative interviews because initially we wanted to do focus groups, but perhaps due to the subject matter, which can be very difficult to discuss, or some other reason, we were really struggling to get either educator or youth participants using a focus group methodology. So we resubmitted our ethics application and switched to individual interviews, which ended up being more successful. So I'll pass it to Kari to explain the SNA surveys and the PAR activities.
Thanks, Kim. So yeah, we then also, as Kim mentioned, as a mixed methodology, we'd also implemented social network analysis surveys. And social network analyses is maybe a new tool or something new for folks here in the session. So this is a great tool that supports or helps in visualizing networks and understanding interconnections between resources and people or institutions, and identifying layers of access of these resources. SNA also helps us a bit understand the patterns of awareness and access and the usefulness of educational resources. And it also comes from understanding in a theoretical level about relationships and network analysis in network theory, sorry. We distributed surveys to a list of 100 organizations that we considered most relevant to this topic in particular, which belong to the Violence Prevention Initiative from Newfoundland and Labrador, that included partner organizations and stakeholders, but also we included organizations that were youth serving and 2SLGBTQI+ specific. And so part of the PAR activities from the data collection and the meetings with our 11 co-researchers, we designed 3 PAR activities with educators and youth. And well, in later slides, we will discuss these activities in more detail. Kim, would you like to finish up with the knowledge mobilization there?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Patty. So yeah, after we had completed the data collection and the PAR activities, we were this whole time we were continually engaging with our 11 co-researchers, and we asked them, you know, what would you like to see as it relates to translating our research findings and into knowledge mobilization products in a way that is accessible and useful to the various groups that we want to engage with. So we ended up developing an infographic, 5 resource summaries, all of which feature youth artwork in various ways, as well as a PAR brief. And we'll get into each of these in turn in the coming slides. So before moving on to the findings, just a really high-level overview of what we found from previous research and the kinds of things we were asking our participants about, particularly in the qualitative interviews. So what others had found was a handful of opportunities as well as barriers for both youth and educators. So I'll go through these quite quickly, but if folks want to come back to this and discuss it in the Q&A, I'm happy to jump back to this slide. So briefly, opportunities for youth include gender and sexuality alliances in schools, peer leadership and mentorship, positive messaging and strengths-based approaches. Opportunities for educators include the presence of school-level anti-discrimination policies, supportive leadership for policy and program implementation. So by program implementation, I mean, for example, like a 2SLGBTQI inclusive healthy relationships program. Also, adequate training and available and active communities of practice have also been identified as key opportunities for educators. Moving on to barriers for youth for healthy relationships education include heteronormativity, so heteronormative sexual education, unsafe and unsupportive school environments, that was a really big one, a lack of representation, representation here referring to a lack of 2SLGBTQI educators, or topics that include 2SLGBTQI experiences and perspectives. And finally, an exclusion of topics like intimacy, trust, and consent. Finally, barriers for educators include similarly a lack of training or resources, a lack of administrative support, a fear of backlash or opposition from, say, peers, school administrators, or parents, as well as a lack of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy here meaning that feeling that you can do the thing that you would like to do, or that you have the internal and external resources available to you to implement, let's say, GBV prevention education. So we'll move now to the meat of our findings. So here are some themes that emerged from our interviews with 8 educators. So broadly speaking, folks talked about a lack of 2SLGBTQI representation among educators or curriculum developers, which in turn shapes the structure and content of the curriculum. Lack of awareness or knowledge of how to integrate Indigenous specific GBV prevention initiatives. So we had asked a couple of questions emerging from the National Inquiry into MMIWG2S, for example, about Indigenous specific GBV prevention, and folks generally, there were many gaps in knowledge and awareness of this. Thirdly, there is a widespread fear of backlash or professional repercussions, especially backlash from parents. And a lot of educators also talked about the promise of GSAs. So because educators are always working against the clock and barely have time to eat lunch, so to speak, they talked about the importance of building on what already exists. So the networks and the trust and the logistical even factors associated with existing GSAs in a particular school is a great place to start when it comes to implementing inclusive GBV prevention curriculum in the schools. So given the length of the webinar, we decided to be somewhat minimal in how many quotes we included, but just including a couple of voices from educators who participated in the project, and I'll read them out now. So one individual who is an educator in Newfoundland and Labrador told us, as a queer teacher, I've had false accusations made against me by parents just because of who I am. It's terrifying. I had to scale back what I taught. No healthy relationships, no gender discussions, because I knew some parents were watching for anything they could twist. That fear of being targeted kept me from giving students the education they deserve. Another educator told us, community building is one of the strongest things we have as the queer community, and leaning into that to help people who are younger is very important. Stuff like GSAs in schools have already been a great stepping stone to that. They're a game changer for school culture and safety and support and community. So I'll move. Oh, sorry. You, Patty.
I'm good to, I'll jump in. I feel it. We also conducted interviews with youth, and from the 9 interviews we conducted with these youth, these were the themes that most highlighted their voices and our findings. So, for example, the need for gender-based violence curriculum to go beyond the basics, youth, and this resonated a lot, that they sort of like get sort of like the same basic information year by year. They would like to see more maybe queer and trans folks coming into classrooms and talking about their own experiences, as representation does matter and it's important in the spaces. And also like even the role of how humor can play in these conversations and educational presentations. It's more approachable, and also like bringing in this neutral perspective of healthy relationships can ensure people don't feel threatened and even minimize backlash. Something else that came up was that there was a need for schools to put more effort into prevention. Like most cases, the administration or school leadership would minimize issues arising of GBV, and would be framing them as just personal issues or individual issues between students or individuals. So that shows a lack of accountability as well with the topic and the issues at hand. So that's also important to highlight. Also, that they would like to see more positive messaging about acceptance, celebration, and focusing on healthy dynamics. As well, this came out a lot in the interviews about the parents and how important it is to involve them in this education and bring that education to parents as well. As well, the importance of GSAs that came up, and addressing online gender-based violence. Similarly, we wanted to bring some of the youth voices and some of the things that were said during this interview. So, for example, one of the participants said that parents who call up schools with a problem, and with a problem meaning specifically around gender, sexuality, gender-based violence prevention, the principals and teachers should stand by the students and teach those parents about acceptance. Another one said that teach younger people that not everyone has to look like you, not everyone has to act like you, like people are different, and that's not a reason to be afraid or aggressive. And another one of the youth participants said that social media needs to be addressed, because I think that this is the biggest threat to the safety of queer folks and in regards to gender-based violence. So now I'm going to talk about our social network analysis survey and the results that we got from it. As mentioned previously, we considered a list of around 100 organizations to survey, and all of these organizations were either violence prevention initiative partners, members, and stakeholders, as well as 2SLGBTQI plus organizations and youth serving organizations. From that list of 100, we got 31 responses, which were a great representation of the community organizations across the different categories. We did get 11 responses from educators. We surveyed grades 7 to 12 educators, and we did find this to be a low response rate within educators, but there was some barriers into getting that participation based on other things that we might be able to chat about towards the end. What we did find with this sample of educators is that there was fair representation in terms of geographical locations. So we had educators from Labrador, Central, Western, Avalon. And from these educators, 7 reported being queer, 8 have or had been a GSA advisor, 6 6 of them had delivered gender-based violence prevention education in the classroom, and one of them mentioned that they invited an expert to talk about gender-based violence prevention instead of delivering that themselves. Now, the survey was divided in 2 parts. The first part was mainly about some demographic information that was asked, and specifically about the delivery of gender-based violence prevention education, either in school or in community spaces. So from this first part, we got from organizations that 15 of them, you can see almost half of them have delivered gender-based violence prevention education. 8 of them reported having programming that is specific for 2SLGBTQI plus youth. 10 of them reported coming into the classroom specifically across different areas of the province to deliver gender-based violence prevention education. And 14 of them reported delivering gender-based violence prevention education in community spaces, saying like they have maybe specific programming or specific presentations that they have constantly delivered in community spaces. So now I'm gonna pass and start talking a bit about part 2 of the survey. We can see here a very colorful image that I'm gonna talk about a little bit more in depth in a moment, just to let you know, like the second part of the survey was about the relationships or the resource access that the respondents, either educators or community-based organizations, were able to share. There were 2 main questions that were asked to respondents. So one was, do you reach out to others for resources that relate specifically to gender-based violence prevention education, anti-bullying, consent, all of these topics that are within that subject area? And by reaching out to others, we meant other organizations from this list of 100 organizations that I mentioned. And we also asked them about school system actors, either educators, guidance counselors, and those school system actors were mostly on the aggregate level, so as a group per se, not necessarily as individual people. And the other question was about if others reach out to you for resources. So from the image, from the map here, we can see there's a lot of colors and shapes. From the shapes, we can see that the diamonds are community organizations that responded to the survey. The circles are other community organizations that did not respond to the survey, but were nominated by the respondents. Now, the squares are school system actors. The square with the sharp corners is the respondent. The square with the soft corners is another school system actor nominated by the respondent. Then we have a down triangle that means a health system actor, like Kim is showing there on the screen. And other could mean maybe another organization outside of St. John's, maybe another type of actor that was not necessarily from the list there, that it's 2 triangles. And then from the colors, we can see there's a lot of diversity in colors, which is great. The purples represent violence prevention initiative organizations, so like Maine Status of Women's, women's centers. Then we have 2SLGBTQI organizations in like the fuchsia, bright fuchsia there. Indigenous organizations that are with orange color. We have pink, a little pink, that it's youth serving orgs. We have the bright green that represents queer serving and youth serving organizations. We can see their quadrangle, Planned Parenthood. Now, some of these are coded with the name of the organization, which were indicated in the survey that we could, but most of them are not. So just that an FYI. Then we have other NL organizations in a more like pistachio green. I don't know how to call that green. And then we have gray, that it's outside organizations. And then we can see the different colors of the squares. The brown, it's a school leader. Like an aqua strong green, it's an education leader, like for example, a GSA advisor. The light green, it's a guidance counselor. And then we have youth as well, and 2SLGBTQI youth in a more like pinkish color. Parents and families are in the white. We can see that on the left side over there. And health system actors that are in the light lilac color. Now, I would also, before I move on, I want to talk about some limitations about this data. You know, this visualization that we're looking at here, it's a mostly like an exploratory picture of the ecosystem. Yeah, that we're going to sort of talk about and look at some of those relationships. But it's also important to note that, for example, as I mentioned earlier, there was a low response rate from educators, so we don't have as much insight of educators' perspective in this data. We also noticed a lot of like a high occurrence of bots or malicious responses that we did our very best to sort through and eliminate and remove. But, you know, it's important to note that and mention it. And there was also a little bit of underreporting about interactions because we gave the option of prefer not to say. And so organizations that responded to the survey did use that response somewhat often. So there's also a bit of underreporting of the different relationships, but it will give us, you know, like a general understanding. It will give us some reflections and things to think about for collaboration opportunities and sharing opportunities in the future. So that said, let's see the main highlights of this data. The main findings is, so from within school systems, which is actually not surprising, you might agree with me, guidance counselors, GSA advisors, and safe and caring schools itinerants, in that order of relevance, were perceived as the ones who have resources to share. They were nominated as ones that would have resources to share about gender-based violence prevention and all of these topic areas around this. And when talking about or within community-based organizations, 8 organizations were perceived as the ones who have gender-based violence prevention resources to share. And this includes Planned Parenthood, Quadrangle, and the Coalition Against the Sexual Exploitation of Youth. And, you know, it's 8 organizations approximately, and some of those are as well from the Violence Prevention Initiative. Now, if we're going to look at another cool map now that shows a bit more the interactions that we sort of, and the findings that we're talking about. So the blue lines are, they ask me for resources, so they nominated others that they would ask them for resources. The red is I ask them for resources, and the black means that they ask me and I ask them. So maybe they share different types of resources among them. We can see, for example, up there, Planned Parenthood has a lot of blue lines. We didn't underreport, so you can see that we reported a lot of connections with others, nominating others as being the ones that ask Planned Parenthood for resources. So we do have a lot of lines going outward. We do have some arrows pointing towards the organization, so it does highlight part of the findings that I was commenting previously about being the ones nominated to have resources to share. We can see the same down below to the left with Quadrangle there as well. We can see arrows pointing at it. But you can see here a bit closer to Quadrangle, 2 squares to the right, that square over there has a lot of arrows pointing towards it. And those arrows are part of that. And that square, actually, I think it's a guidance, the group of guidance counselors. So as I mentioned in the findings, right, as being one of those that are perceived to have resources to share. So we can see some of those interactions. We can see that there are some isolates on the top corner to the left. All of those who are respondents, actually. So there's an organization respondent in the diamond at the top, and then we have the 3 squares that are all by themselves. So they didn't nominate anyone, so they seem to be a bit isolated from resources. So we can see here as an opportunity area to, you know, increase access to these types of resources and increase collaborations and resource sharing. And it can also gives us that initial thoughts on where are these hubs where resources can flow better, right? Because that's part of these findings were also came from some specific SNA measures that if you have questions about them, we can chat about them at the end. But these measures that show how these hubs or these nodes, these specific organizations facilitate the flow of resource sharing because they tend to be those hubs of being asked a lot for those resources. And we can point out to different other connections here. If you see on the bottom, there's a diamond that it's going towards downward triangle. So we can see one of our organization respondents reaching out to a health system actor for resources. So, this is showing maybe an subject expert matter in the health system that could provide this type of resources to a youth serving organization that requires them. So just like as an overall, visualization of how these interactions happen. Okay, now let's talk about our participatory action research activities. As we were mentioning at the beginning, we had in-person activities happening for youth in Happy Valley Goose Bay and in St. John's. We had a partnership and a collaboration as part of the research project, but also as part of this activity in itself in Happy Valley Goose Bay with the Labrador Friendship Centre. This event was led by an Indigenous instructional artist, and both in Happy Valley Goose Bay and in St. John's, we did an art-based activity. In St. John's, our partner for this event was the YWCA St. John's, and youth were prompted with certain questions about gender-based violence to reflect on, and they created paintings that emerged from these prompts. And we'll see those paintings shortly. But this was all of these youth participants that attended these events were provided with an honorarium. And since this was a way for students to feel a way of expressing themselves and reflect on these topics in a space that was safe and using arts as a medium. We also hosted virtual events with educators, 1.5 hours each, to review resources that were created that we're going to see also in a bit, and provide feedback on them. Here we can see some of the art created by youth. That dragon in particular is my favorite of them all. And some of the questions that were asked to them, right? Like, what would a safer world without gender-based violence look like? What stereotypes or misconceptions about us need to be addressed to prevent gender-based violence? And so on. I don't know if I'm missing anything from this slide scheme that you'd like to add on. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kari. Yeah, we can definitely come back to that painting slide in the Q&A if folks have any thoughts about what resonated with them when looking at the artwork as well. There's certainly a lot of beautiful artwork and a lot of things that could be discussed from them. So if we have time, I'm happy to jump back to that slide. For the rest of the webinar today, we'll be focusing on knowledge mobilization. So what we did with the stories and experiences that were generously shared with us and how we're distributing that. And to begin, I'll share a screenshot of the project's landing page. So I don't know if this is already in the chat, but it'll be pasted into the chat. But this is kind of the main page for the project. On the bottom, you can jump to a project background. You can jump to the Peaks and Valleys brief that talks about the opportunities and challenges, and I'll unpack a little bit of that as well. We have participant perspectives, which is in an infographic style, and just really highlight some of the most poignant quotes that emerged from our qualitative interviews. We have our 5 resource summaries for different groups, which I'll also go through today. And finally, we have a gallery of all the artwork that the youth created. We just really wanted to be able to showcase that on our landing page. So if we don't have time to chat through the artwork today, please take a moment to check out that gallery. So one of our first knowledge mobilization products was a brief that we wrote. So this document reflects on both peaks, so that is opportunities and facilitators, as well as valleys, i.e. barriers and challenges, as we journeyed through the project. The purpose of the document is to provide researchers, nonprofit and community-based organizations, as well as community members themselves with insights regarding the factors that may either help or hinder efforts to conduct truly collaborative community-based research. So the brief is organized by the type of factor, as well as their associated opportunities and challenges. So the first was project partner and co-researcher relationships. So a peak here was that we had really strong, trusting, and reciprocal relationships. But a valley was that we really struggled to engage with smaller grassroots organizations due to, for example, funding restrictions and other barriers like being severely understaffed. Methodological factors, what went well was that we had a really collaborative and community-based and communicative approach to engagement strategies, which helped us to pivot in spite of delayed ethics approval processes and some issues we ran into with the school board. But like Kari had mentioned earlier, the issue of bots and fraudulent survey responses really stymied our methodological approaches. And we then really had to take a lot of time to like move through all of the survey responses and determine their legitimacy. Geographical factors were another thing. So what went well here was that we had really well integrated informational networks, which resulted in relatively quick recruitment of co-researchers. But we also had some data collection difficulties, and some of this, especially for the in-person events, could be related to the vast and rural landscape of Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly Labrador. As it relates to safety, we had intensive involvement and endorsement of local partners, which likely increased participants' sense of safety when deciding to participate. But kind of on the other side of that, there could have also been a fear of being outed or facing negative repercussion from participating in an in-person activity, because it may be harder to maintain privacy, especially if you need a ride to the community center that kindly hosted our in-person activities. Institutional and logistical factors were also are also discussed at length in the brief. So here, you know, we highlight that a peak was the generosity and kindness of our core project partners, which were crucial to the project's success. But on the other hand, the biggest challenge we faced in this project was the institutional gatekeeping that we encountered in our efforts to work with NL School Board. So we ended up not receiving approval from the NL Schools Research Request Committee, and it took 7 months for us to get a face-to-face meeting with the committee after we had received their initial rejection letter and responded with requested modifications in hopes that they would then approve the project. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the brief and a lot of the lessons kind of learned throughout the course of this nearly 2-year project. We also, as I mentioned earlier, created 5 resource summaries, and each of which offers different tools and supports in GBV prevention and awareness. So one of our summaries focused on and speaks to 2SLGBTQI youth, the other to parents and guardians, another to educators, another to PE teachers and coaches, and finally, one that's directed to community-based organizations. So I'll map out kind of the scope of resources within each of these resource summaries. So for the youth, The resource summary includes information on support with school stuff, so bathrooms, harassment, bullying, that kind of stuff. Dealing with unsupportive family, addressing online GBV, so that was a direct response to the themes emerging from our qualitative interviews. Dating violence, healthy relationships, finding support, allyship, and resource libraries for further reading. For parents and guardians, we have resources for supporting gender diverse and intersex kids, supportive parenting behavior, a guide for in-school transitions, supporting 2SLGBTQI Indigenous use, as well as children's and parenting book lists. For educators, we have resources on school and classroom supports, violence prevention, sex education, allyship, Two-Spirit specific resources, which was again in response to a theme that emerged in our data collection, that there's a real gap in knowledge and awareness about Indigenous specific resources as it relates to GBV prevention, and research reports, and finally some free and online training that's geared toward educators. For the final two resource summaries, the one directed at PE teachers and coaches provides resources focused on sports inclusion. So we have resources from the Canada Games Council's gender inclusion policy, as well as the Play to Win human rights campaign. And we also have training and curriculum resources. So we have the Outsport Toolkit and a resource from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports. And finally, for the community-based organization resource summary, it's structured a bit differently from the other summaries because the type of information that they're seeking, we worked with the co-researchers to make sure that it would be of highest utility for these organizations. So we decided to structure this summary by dividing it in these ways. So we started with educational presentations, educational programs, social support and peer support programs, counseling support programs, and crisis hotlines. So the goal here is to equip community organizations with a resource summary that they can hand out either in physical form or in email form, so that they're not doing the very laborious task of cobbling together resources from across the vastness of the internet. And here,
Kim, if I could just jumping a little bit in this one, I wanted also to add that these resources could also be geared to the public in general, and it could also work as an updated resource list of what community organizations have to offer to the public, to schools, to youth. It highlights some of the education programs that came out from the survey, but also highlighting what organizations are doing already on the ground and the type of presentations that they can provide. So I think it also functions for the public to know what's out there, what supports are out there within community, and how they can access them.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of flavor to the slide, I added another piece of artwork that someone did, and it's just so bright and colorful. I just wanted to add it to the slide. And I had noted this earlier in describing the brief, but just kind of wanted to end with a high-level overview of some of the lessons learned throughout the course of this project. So one of the first key lessons is that it's really critical to identify and secure project champions from each stakeholder group involved in the project's life course. So of particular importance here is securing champions from individuals or groups who have quote unquote gatekeeping power. So that is those who have the ability to impact the project's goals, objectives, and methods if they take issue with one or more aspects of the project following the finalization of the materials and ethics approval. And second, it's important to ensure frequent communication and engagement with co-researchers and project partners, as well as other community members. So even if the updates and communication are simple to relay, or simply to relay that the project is still adapting or addressing to a particular challenge, like I provided an overview of earlier, this kind of continuous informational flow really helps to maintain trust and momentum. So this is a positive aspect of the project that helped us immensely in spite of the challenges that we face throughout. And I'll pass it to Kari to kind of provide an overview of the final 2 lessons learned.
Sure. So third, we have built in flexible and lengthy project timelines and adequate engagement budgets. So as we mentioned, as Kim mentioned in the one of the peaks and valleys, the timeline might not have been enough to engage as many smaller community partners or community-based collaborators, and build those within the budget so that there is enough resources to actually reach further, especially with projects that are provincial or even regional, etc., right? And finally, the role of organizations like Egale, Planned Parenthood in mobilizing our existing national and local networks and outreach capacity to support teacher upskilling, connecting youth, and provide resources to enhance access to appropriate supports. As we saw from the network visualization and the social network analysis, there is a lot of value in this central hubs of organizations that can facilitate the dissemination and sharing of resources. And so this also points to involve or build or work through relationships and sustaining them into collaborative endeavors to share resources and support youth.
Thanks so much, Kari. So that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. I'll skip past this slide just so that if folks do have any follow-up questions after the Q&A, I just wanted to put this slide up. So you can contact me at kseida@egale.ca, or the research team has a kind of group email. If you prefer to email research@egale.ca, our director monitors that and will pass any relevant emails my way. So with that, I'll stop sharing so we can have more face-to-face engagement.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you both for that. That was incredible. Such an important project, and like so great to see the artwork. I would agree that the dragon is my favorite. It's just so good, so heartwarming. Yeah, folks, if you have questions, we have a few minutes. You can pop it into the chat. There's a Q&A function if you would rather submit a question that way. While we're waiting for questions to roll in, though, I selfishly have a question that I would like to ask you too. So I'm sort of curious about if it kind of came up in some of the interviews or some of the conversations that you were having with participants, like how the rural context plays a role. So were there maybe specific barriers or maybe even like opportunities that folks talked about that maybe were unique to kind of the rural context? Yeah, just curious if that came up in your conversations.
Yeah, I can take this one if that's okay. All the time, I think specifically, like, especially with a province like Newfoundland and Labrador, which is so wide in territory, but at the same time so spread out with a lot of like small pockets of rural communities. I think that's an ongoing struggle and challenge. And I think there's a lot of work to be done of how to engage in ways that can support rural communities and rural queer and trans youth that are out there, even educators, in finding ways to share resources and support each other in that sense. I think it's still an ongoing conversation, it's still an ongoing challenge that not just within like this particular aspect or theme, gender-based violence, but in all aspects of social life, right? So yes, I think it's something that needs to still be looked at, still be worked on, and still having these conversations about. Yeah.
Totally. Awesome. Thanks. We do have a question that just rolled in. So somebody wrote in and said, doing research with queer and trans youth is so fun because they often have amazing hopes and dreams for the future. Did the youth in the project have any hopes about GBV education in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, so many. I remember like every time that I would speak to somebody, like I feel that they would be like, yeah, like why don't they do this or that? Like I feel that why don't we all can just be accepting and be out there? And I mean like I'm 35 years old and I feel like youth in their young age, they're so empowered. They are so driven and want to build these like the capacity within themselves in leadership. So it was great to see that. And I do think that they have a lot of hope, and I think that they do have a lot of ideas of how to go around the issues that they face.
Yeah, just to briefly build on that, you know, the online world, which I'm I'm an elder millennial, so it's hard for me to uh that came up too. It was like the promise of how to build and maintain peer support and mentorship networks on this front in the online world. So I think any successful GBV prevention initiative or programming has to account for how do we do kind of analog, real like in-person stuff, but also how do we move everything online and how do we mobilize what's happening online, because that's where so much of these conversations are happening, and that's where youth are connecting with each other and finding information for that matter. So there's definitely perils, but there's so much promise with that as well.
Totally. Awesome. Thanks. And then, so I feel like you folks talked a little bit about kind of backlash in different ways that were maybe coming up for educators, but also like youth were talking about this too. And so I guess like, was there like, did people also talk about kind of like backlash to GSAs? Like you talked about GSAs being sort of important in this, on this topic. But also like the idea of inviting like an expert in to do this education instead of maybe like a teacher who maybe doesn't have that self-efficacy to do it. Did you get a sense from your conversations that there was kind of backlash towards those things specifically?
Well, yeah, I mean, specifically towards GSAs, I mean, broadly, of course, it was sort of like talked about, but I think the backlash that was mentioned was mainly towards teachers, like in the classroom, more than like to the specific GSA groups. And of course, like as one of the quotes that we shared, right? One of them that was a queer teacher saying that they were targeted specifically. So I think it was mostly towards individual teachers, individual things they were doing, and specifically if they were queer, that the targeting was even higher, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so because of that, one educator with whom we spoke was saying that for that very reason, it's useful to bring in a third party like PPNL, who already does healthy relationships education, to come in and be an external person to do that. So the backlash is not directed at that individual educator.
Definitely, yeah. Either experts or even lived experiences from community advocates or community members that would bring in their lived experience as a queer person to the classroom.
Right. Incredible. Well, thank you both. I think we're just about at time, so I think we might have to kind of cut it there. But yeah, thank you both so much for this presentation and for everybody for joining us for this conversation. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I don't know how to say goodbye, sorry. But yeah, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Please don't hesitate to reach out via email if you have any questions or thoughts coming up afterwards.
Yeah.